So, I finally carved out a little time before bed to start working on a series review, and I wanted to start with a show I grew up on that's still to this day my favorite of all time. But let me say up front that I'm not here to regale you with trivia about the show's production, or to examine how the attitudes and events of the time influenced its writing and themes. I'm also not the type whose video titled Why We Love Butter would insist that to understand our adoration for the savory dairy spread, we must first go back to 1893 to a little town called Crabs, meaning I don't do backstory, I just do story. So despite this being a long one, I'm only here to do one thing: review the dimension of imagination in an area which we call the Twilight Zone. Welcome to Stream Come True, where nothing is spoiler-free. Usually. In this case, given the fact that the Twilight Zone excels in its twists, M. Night wishes his name were T-Zone, I won't be spoiling the ending of the episodes. And I'm only covering Season 1, which you can watch for free. Whether I do this again for Season 2 or not depends on the win. Now here's a friendly disclaimer. Because I'm reviewing a series that explores a range of topics, including social ones, there will be social commentary in this video. If that bothers you because you only watch videos to be entertained, haha hee hee, not to be lectured or reminded of society's problems, back away from the play button. And I say that with all the tender loving care of a barbecue pitmaster waving a vegan away from his meat. Don't insert yourself where you don't want to be, then complain about it. Also, unlike my film reviews, there won't be much footage here, if any, because my thoughts on the show don't really revolve around the visuals, so you can get away with playing this in the background. Speaking of background, here's some about me. I love speculative fiction, mainly science fiction. It's my favorite genre, followed by fantasy, horror, mystery, and the supernatural. So the Twilight Zone is peak storytelling for me because it blends my favorite genres with some of my favorite things: anthology format, interesting commentary, and the raw performances, art direction, and cinematography of the early days of film and television. I adore the show so much that I've seen every episode of every season, from the classic to the modern, and the films, repeatedly. With one exception. I never finished the one hosted by Jordan Peele that released back in 2019, because I watched the first episode of that and it put me off. Still, I'd be remiss not to mention the elephant in the room. And no, it isn't if some aspects of the show have aged poorly given when it aired. Very few things age well across the board because, surprise, society changes. It's whether or not the Twilight Zone ever had a bad episode, and my answer is yes. Every episode of The Outer Limits, because while I enjoyed both series, Toll was definitely the less interesting friend who inserts himself into more interesting conversations. And you can't really talk about the Twilight Zone without someone bringing it up. So I'll say for the record that The Outer Limits was great in its own way. It certainly wasn't the copycat you might assume it to be on paper, and now that I've given it a shout, we can get on with this review without ever mentioning it again. We begin the begin with episode 1, Where is Everybody? And if you've never watched The Twilight Zone, it's kind of like a collection of fables in that each episode typically has a theme or lesson to teach. This one is about isolation. It opens with a man walking down a road, which I already love given that most stories don't start in the middle of nowhere and nothing like you accidentally skip the first 10 minutes, but it makes sense because just as we have no clue who or where this man is, he hasn't the faintest either. Under different circumstances, that would be a red flag, since amnesia is typically a cheap plot device that doesn't elevate the payoff, it just delays it. Like in a lot of horror games. What's that? Yet another man killed his wife and child and doesn't recall? Yowee! I can't wait to waste hours crouch walking through Dr. Doorslam's House of Flickering Lights while reading notes with such chilling revelations as, "It's your fault," and "Guilty, guilty, shame, remember." Memento is a film that made amnesia integral to the character's arc, and it completely reframed the narrative in a way that was both clever and shocking. It's a fine example of putting amnesia to good use, and while this episode isn't quite playing 4D chess like Memento, the payoff isn't just that the main character remembers what he forgot. I also appreciate that the tension doesn't come from the fact that he doesn't remember, but from his solitude, because the hook is that everything seems abandoned. So I love this episode because I didn't see the ending coming, which is rare, and it's a fitting examination of the nature of mankind. For all of the moaning some do about preferring solitude, humans are social creatures. There's a reason solitary confinement is considered especially cruel. We aren't built for it. Yes, you may want to be alone sometimes, but no one wants to be lonely. There's comfort in the existence of others around you, and the fact that if you wanted to speak to them, you could. What would life be like without that? To look out your window and see no one, to walk down the street and hear no one, to not know if or when you'd ever be near another human being again. We got a watered-down taste of that during the pandemic, and I think we can all agree it didn't go well. Some marbles were lost and never found, so thumbs up for this episode scenario being worse. Episode 2, One for the Angels, is about a kind old salesman who meets death. I'm not a fan of this one, and it's certainly not the best the series has to offer, but it's a lighthearted tale of humanity, the value of life's ambitions, of selfless generosity, and how we shine in our uniqueness and cleverness to overcome. It stars Ed Wynn, who you might recognize as the iconic voice of the Mad Hatter in the original Alice in Wonderland, and my favorite part of the episode is his sales pitch. You'd think he was selling crack, and you'll get what I mean when you see it. Again, I don't care for this episode, but it's sweet, and I'm okay with a little sugar. Episode 3, Mr. Denton on Doomsday, follows a washed-up drunk who finds himself back on top thanks to a mysterious gun. And I like this one a lot more than I don't. The hook is that the gun allows him to shoot with quick-draw precision, garnering the respect he'd previously lost at the bottom of a bottle. And what strengthens the episode for me is the fact that while he revels in that moment of his phoenix rising, the implications of it leave him hollow, because he's been down this road before. Being the best shooter means people will challenge him. It means more violence, more death, the moral stench that led him to drink in the first place. Aside from this burden of greatness, the story explores the paths we take in life, and how one man's right direction can be another man's wrong. We're all coming from different places after all, so we have to take different roads to reach the same destination. And I'm not saying that's what the episode is about, it's just what I took from it, which is true for this entire video. I'm not telling you what the Twilight Zone means, I'm just sharing what it means to me. The one thing I don't like about this episode is that the peddler's name is a bit on the nose. But I do like that his printed name has an embellishment that resembles a snake's tongue, so it's kind of like his name is going blah 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 blah, which makes up for the rest. The episode also features the best back kick I've ever seen. If anyone kicks the door you're standing behind like the guy does here, you need to move out, okay? Pitch a tent in the woods and reflect. Episode 4, the 16mm Shrine, is about a fallen movie star, and I should mention at this point how beautifully written Serling's narrations are. Lots of shows have an intro and an outro, but The Twilight Zone was a masterclass in meaningful bookends that weren't too pretentious. I love Serling's metaphors as much as I love the Crypt Keeper's puns, and if you've never seen Tales from the Crypt, okay. For the record, Serling didn't write every episode of the series, but the show was his creation, and by all accounts, fellow writers sought to respect his sensibilities, so even when the words aren't his, they're still spiritually him. All of the episodes I've mentioned so far were written by Rod Serling, so I'll call it out when I get to ones he didn't write. But this episode, for me, is about our aversion to change, and the desperate longing for the past that, ironically, traps us in the present. Here, that very same longing, if it runs deep enough, can be enough to detach you from the reality that you can't accept, allowing you to create your own, one that heals the open wound of nostalgia, but at a cost. It isn't one of my favorite episodes in terms of story, but I love the dialogue and the way the main character is portrayed. Her pining feels authentic, and her retreat further into her delusions is well-paced. I also enjoy that classics like these remind me of the bodies of the time, male and female alike. It's like they all had shapewear around their ass, only the shape they were going for was 2 Milano cookies side by side. Now you may have noticed that I haven't been using the actors' names much. That's mainly because they're all dead now, and something about that makes me want to focus on performances instead. So I'll probably only call out the actors I remember from other work, keeping in mind that most of these people had sprawling careers spanning decades. Episode 5, Walking Distance, is about a burnt-out businessman, and in hindsight, I like that this episode follows the 16mm Shrine. There is a woman who lost everything and wants more, while here is a man who has everything and wants less. Their problems aren't the same, but they seek a solution in the same place, in a life left behind. It's more apparent because they're back-to-back, and I like that one focused on a woman and the other a man, because while society progresses and there are exceptions to every rule, some things persist well enough, like what it means to age as a woman, and that perceived loss of value and purpose we too often internalize, or what it means to lead as a man, and the pressures and expectations of dominance when all you want is to submit. Beyond that, I never liked this episode that much because nothing about it stood out to me. Not the acting or writing or even the ending. But a lot of T-Zone fans put it high on their list. Maybe because it's relatable. After spending years being an adult, who doesn't want to get 3 scoops of ice cream and ride a merry-go-round? Someone with motion sickness who's lactose intolerant? Yes, but that isn't the point. Episode 6, Escape Clause, is about a hypochondriac who makes a deal with the devil to extend his life. And I don't like this one. It is full of that quick-witted snark typical of the writing of that era, which I love. In fact, most of my favorite insults are from the Golden Age, because you just can't beat some of the things they say. Like this woman in a film I can't remember now, who told another one to go bingle her bongle. That's the most me way of telling someone to go fuck themselves that I've ever heard come out of a mouth that's not mine. but I don't find the episode itself engaging or even good. The setup makes the outcome predictable, plot points fly by so quickly that the whole thing feels like a montage, and the moral of the story basically boils down to being careful what you wish for, which is fine, just not here. Episode 7, The Lonely, is about a convict imprisoned on another planet. And I touched on solitary confinement with the first episode, but I have a question for you. What would make you feel more alone? Being alone in a small space or a big one? I'd prefer a big space because being alone and restricted in my movement and surroundings sounds like a freaking nightmare, but I do think a larger space magnifies just how alone you are, which seems to be the case for James Corey, who was sentenced to 50 years alone on a dusty planet, his only contact being the officers who ferry supplies from Earth every 3 months. To ease his suffering, the captain of that ship brings him a robot companion in the form of a woman. And setting aside the fact that we all know what would happen first if a man trapped alone on a planet for 4 years got an anatomically correct fembot to play with, this one was interesting. Because they made it a point that despite being a machine, the robot, named Alicia, is essentially human, able to think and feel and live like us, both physically and emotionally. And I like that I'm revisiting these episodes because I don't remember what I thought about this one at all. I remember it being one of my favorites, I just don't recall what went through my head the first time I saw it or any time since. But watching it now, something came to mind that couldn't have before because it wasn't a thing before, at least not by name. Incel. And I'll tell you the exact moment that word popped into my head. When James was berating Alicia, likening her to his car, he said, "I'm sick of being mocked by the memory of women, and that's all that you are. A reminder to me that I'm so lonely, I'm about to lose my mind." It's a unique parallel to draw because his celibacy is actually involuntary given that he's stranded on another planet, compared to incels who, by and large, seem stranded on a world of their own making, one where they're the victims of life rather than their own composition. Not to stray too far from the review, but it's a shame how many incels would have no problem finding a girl if not for the way they are, their attitudes and opinions. Many of them are attractive, funny, or smart, but they fall down this rabbit hole of perceived shortcomings and personal failures that make them ripe for the picking by manipulative hands that tell them they're entitled to what they lack, that those things have been stolen from them, or that society is engineered to deprive them. And they become architects of self-sabotage, draping themselves in thorns, then saying you're the problem for not wanting a prick. Involuntary or not, the result is the same: loneliness masquerading as contempt. But this episode isn't about that. If it were, it'd be an incel redemption arc, albeit a very quick one. Instead, we see James confess his loneliness and embrace Alicia's companionship in a healthy way. I will say, it's worth mentioning that he only calmed down after seeing her cry, because don't quote me on this, but I remember a study claiming that female tears contain a chemical that lowers testosterone. So one hypothesis was that it serves as a natural deterrent of male aggression. The males in the study experienced reduced sexual arousal as well after sniffing female tears, which is certainly something, assuming the study is accurate. And it occurred to me while watching this episode how such a thing might recontextualize the male-female dynamic in television and film. Picture all of the scenes you've ever seen where a guy is screaming his head off at a girl until he notices the tears in her eyes, prompting him to stop, apologize, and console her. Imagine now that, unlike how it's written, that seeing her in pain opened his eyes to his brutish behavior and softened his heart, it was actually that the chemicals leaking from her face were so potent they sucked all the aggro right out of him. I don't know if I'd find that funny or sad. Regardless, I like this episode, and it shows how we're nourished by companionship, and that the love of even one person can fill an empty world with life. What the ending says, on the other hand, I'll leave to you, because yikes. Episode 8, Time Enough at Last, is about a book lover. Sort of. It's based on a short story of the same name by Lynn Venable, and it feels like it's based on a short story given how tightly written it is and the way it's resolved. I'll link to the story in the box if you'd like to read it, but this is one of my favorite episodes and easily one of the most iconic. It's been parodied to death, Family Guy being one example that comes to mind, so even if you've never seen it, you probably know the twist. And since I can't say much without spoiling it for those who don't, I'll just share my thoughts on the story in general. I'd say it's a humorous yet heartbreaking tale that revels in the cruelty of irony. It speaks to the value of time and how we spend it, criticizes how often what little time we have is spent on someone else, and in a way, laments the obsessions we bury ourselves alive with. Things that distract us from life so much that it feels like life is distracting us from them. Those are the kinds of passions and pursuits that run the risk of isolating us from everything that arguably matters more. And as enjoyable or comforting as they may be, we should all fear the day when a single preoccupation is all we have left. It's another episode tackling solitude from a different angle, and my love for it is due entirely to the plot. The writing falls flat for me otherwise, specifically when it comes to the main character's thoughts to himself, and with the narration midway through, which is something I hate in T-Zone, so I'll probably mention it again. But my issue with it here is that it's like an unnecessary play-by-play from someone narrating your life. Picture Melissa, age 25, pale skin with a dour face, a rainy day drowning her ambitions in disappointment. The tiny droplets cascading off the roof like frosted flakes off the side of her bowl. As she pours the milk, a telephone ringing in the distance reminds her that today is the last day of her life. Like, that kind of thing works for the intro and outro because it's a setup for what's to come and commentary on what just happened respectively. In the middle, it's just telling us what we're seeing at the same time that we're seeing it, which is like round nachos, cheesy and pointless. It's still a great episode though as far as the ending goes, and it stars Burgess Meredith, maybe best known to people these days as Mickey from the Rocky franchise. Episode 9, Perchance to Dream, is about a man who refuses to sleep because he's convinced he'll die. Serling didn't write this one. It was written by Charles Beaumont, and it feels like it's based on a short story, even though it's not. I love this episode because it's a simple mystery. Is this man crazy or is he right? And it examines the nature of reality, exploring what exists versus what our minds manifest, and how much that distinction matters. It's not at the top of my list, but I have a soft spot for it and the way it's written, with one man telling his story and the bizarre nature of the story he tells. The writing, for me, is some of the best in terms of imagery and tone, which Richard Conte's delivery does justice, and the Doctor's last line questions an assumption we make as a society that may unsettle us to stop making. It's definitely worth a watch, but it does remind me that if you're sensitive to the quality of the special effects back in the day, or lack thereof, you may find a lot of things hilarious in the Twilight Zone that aren't supposed to be. I grew up watching classics, so I feel like I subconsciously see past that stuff most of the time, but if you're not used to it and all you see is memes, just do your best, okay? Episode 10, Judgment Night, is about a man on a ship. And I realize that's vague, but saying anything more might give the twist away. Then again, the story telegraphs itself, which is the main reason I don't like this episode as much as I could. There are also a lot of elements we've already seen in other episodes, like not knowing how you ended up where you are. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's where the Twilight Zone's twisteronies come into play. I think of the episodes like siblings. They all share the same DNA, but they come out differently, in large part thanks to their endings. So the Twilight Zone isn't the kind of show where you can watch most of an episode and say that you've seen enough to judge it. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know until the very last frame. That's not the case with this episode, but you get the point. And while I hate its lack of subtlety, I do love the tone of the setting and Nehemiah Persoff's haunted portrayal of the passenger. As for any lessons to be learned, I'll stick with the most obvious one, that karma's a bitch. Episode 11, And When the Sky Was Opened, is about astronauts who return to Earth. Only one of them remembers things a little bit different. It's another one Serling adapted from a short story, Disappearing Act by Richard Matheson. If I can find it, I'll link to it. But this one is good old-fashioned sci-fi with a dash of metaphysics thrown in, and some aspects of it remind me of Junji Ito's work, though I can't fully explain why. It's something about the chilling, abstract way the characters describe their situation, which is enough for me to like it. The story itself is very basic, so it's the performances that support it most, and I've got no takeaways, only another question. What would it take for the world to convince you that you're wrong when you know that you're right? Episode 12, What You Need, is about a miserable louse that takes advantage of a peddler who always knows what you need. It's yet another one Serling adapted from a short story of the same name by C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner under the pseudonym Lewis Paget, and I love it for a number of reasons. When the peddler first encounters the trash heap posing as a man, he, like the audience, can sense the danger wafting off this guy. And there's a constant tension throughout the episode, not knowing how vicious the man is or how far he'll go. I'm sure we've all had moments where we saw something that made us dread what might happen next, and it's surprisingly intense. But as much as I like this one, I realize in retrospect that what I love about the episodes based on short stories somewhat undermines or overshadows what I love about the Twilight Zone. It's hard to explain the difference between an original episode and one based on tiny prose, because it's like when you watch a movie and can immediately tell it was based on a book. If someone asked you how you could tell, no answer you gave would preclude it from being an original script. You just intuitively know that it wasn't. wasn't. There's a pattern your mind recognizes, even if it can't be expressed, and the same thing happens with me and these episodes. A part of it may be that short stories lend themselves well to shallow narratives, because they have to pack a punch quickly, and that's more easily done with what happens than who it happens to. So they're not always that character-driven, especially in genres like science fiction, where the need for complexity in character or theme can be replaced with cleverness in plot. All of the episodes are basically short stories, but they usually strike a balance between all of the above that allows each of those elements some grace to not be as tidy if they work well as a whole. Meanwhile, the episodes based on actual short stories feel more focused and linear in a way that's again hard to describe. It isn't that far off from what Serling writes on his own, it's just different enough that I notice it. But I said all of that to say that this is one of my favorite episodes because it's one of my favorite stories, even though as an episode, I don't think it's that great. I guess that's why I feel like the episodes based on shorts undercut T-Zone's strengths. Since the execution isn't the highlight, the episode as a whole takes a backseat to the premise. This is also one of the few episodes that doesn't stick the landing for me because it keeps going after it sticks it. It feels like a modern-day post-credit cameo. Like the people it focused on were a big deal, and I just don't know that because I wasn't alive. As for my takeaways, one is not to be greedy in life, to take what you're given gratefully and make the most of it, and the wisdom that what we need to be happy is often the little, everyday things we take for granted, not the big things we aspire to. Unless that big thing is being rich, in which case call me a baker and give me that dough. Mo money, mo problem solved. Episode 13, The Four of Us Are Dying, is about a man who can change his face. It's another adaptation of a short story, All of Us Are Dying by George Johnson, and I don't like this one at all. I find it dull and forgettable, and I kept tuning it out as I watched it. But I do like the way they use transitions and camera movements to disguise his transformations, and I give it major points for the relationship the character is confronted with that ultimately breaks him. I thought that was handled very well. It also left me with the lesson that everyone means something to someone. Each of us has a life of our own, so no one who walks a mile in another man's shoes will ever find himself going nowhere. Episode 14, Third from the Sun, which reminds me of Third Rock from the Sun with John Lithgow. I love that show, and I almost loved this episode. It's about two families on the eve of nuclear apocalypse, and would you believe that it's also based on a short story? One by Richard Matheson. What are the odds? And looking back, I enjoyed it more the first time I saw it, because the tension was some word other than palpable, since that's overused, and it certainly has the kind of ending T-Zone is known for. It just loses its spice once you know it. So it's a good episode. There just isn't enough there to make it rewatchable. And it calls to mind another difference I noticed with the episodes based on short stories. It's harder for me to see past their surface level meaning. I like to think that Serling explores the human condition in his original scripts in a way that stirs the mind, and I just don't get that from these adaptations. It's not that they don't have deeper meanings, I'm sure they do, they just don't inspire me to consider them. But maybe that'll change as the series goes on, since I hardly remember which episodes are which, and keeping track of it now has been pretty enlightening. I now have a glass of milk, so excuse me if you hear my mouth smacking away, but episode 15, I Shot an Arrow into the Air, is about 3 astronauts that crash land on a harsh desert world. I think the story was a collaborative effort between Serling and a writer named Madeline Champion, who was said to have posed it, which may be why it comes across like an episode based on a short story, even though it isn't. I personally wouldn't rank it that high because it retreads some of the same ground T-Zone nailed prior, or does better down the road, and there's nothing intriguing about its premise to make revisiting those elements worth it. It also has that midway narration that I don't like. But the performances are fantastic, and the episode is iconic with a familiar twist that you'll either see coming or see coming from a mile away. I'm tempted to spoil it by telling you what it reminds me of, but I'll leave that gorilla in the mist. As for my takeaway, never leave your morals at the door, no matter the room you walk into. You never know what's inside. Episode 16, The Hitchhiker, is a disgustingly hyphenated tale about a woman who, oddly enough, encounters a mysterious hitchhiker. It's based not on a short story, but on a radio play, which is awesome because I love radio plays, and I'm grateful to Audible for bringing them back. And in case you're confused, I'm not talking about audio books, I mean audio experiences. So I like this episode, and it does some things I wouldn't expect it to do if it came out today. But I do wonder if the twist was less obvious when it first aired. Because at this point, we have decades worth of media to draw from, and that means decades worth of cliches to tip us off to what's really going on, making expectations that much harder to subvert. I knew what was happening right away, and I don't think it's because it was telegraphed as much as it is that the execution was so familiar. Regardless, I like the grounded tone and the focus on a single lead grappling with her own thoughts. It's also refreshing that she's on a road trip since the setting changes more often than in many of the episodes. I could say that what I like most is that everything she encounters feels believable. It's not like a horror flick where someone runs down the street being chased by a killer and somehow every single house is either empty or there's no reaction from the people inside. No lights turn on, you don't see anyone pull a curtain aside to look out the window to see what all the screaming is about or who the fuck is banging on their door at 3 o'clock in the morning. The street's just dead. I'm much more sympathetic to the character here because it isn't so contrived that everything only happens the way it does to prolong her suffering. And for my takeaway, not that there has to be one, I just enjoy episodes more when there is one, there's a point when the woman picks up a sailor to have some company, and it brought to mind our fear of the unknown and how we'd rather deal with the devil we know. Because she understands the danger she placed herself in, picking up some random guy in the middle of the night, she even dares to lean into it. But it's because whatever threat he poses doesn't scare her as much as the man she's trying to escape. It's a reminder that the terrible things we run to say a lot about the awfulness of what we run from. Episode 17, The Fever, is about a man who can't stop gambling, and it's an episode I always forget about because I hate it. In fact, the only thing I like about it is calling a slot machine a one-armed bandit. Is there a takeaway? Sure. Addiction is dangerous. Gambling is a vice. Old people need to go to bed early. I don't care enough about this episode to talk about it. That's my review. Moving on. Episode 18, The Last Flight, Vroom Vroom Vroom, is about a pilot, and I'm not sure how much I want to spoil. On the one hand, the episode starts with a twist, but on the other hand, it ends with another one. But it was written by Richard Matheson, and I don't know how I feel about it. It's yet another one I don't remember until I see it again, and another one that's straightforward, like a short story, which makes sense given who wrote it, but it's the first one I think I'm entirely neutral about. Outside of the frantic running into the distance, the old-timey punches, and asking someone if a cloud was white, as if there are that many options to choose from when it comes to clouds, nothing held my interest. Except for this hole in the ground. What is this? This seems dangerous. To be honest, I almost fell asleep watching this, which means it's time for an intermission! Did you think those were only for film reviews? Nay! We all need intermissions all of the time. So why don't you put on a suit, pull up to the 5th dimension, and like the video. Everyone square? Fair. Episode 19, The Purple Testament, is about a lieutenant who can see when someone is going to die. And it's not interesting plot-wise, but it's a decent character study. Ignoring that the lead, William Reynolds, is as pretty as a picture, his performance is very muted, which I appreciate more than if he were running around screeching every time he saw death on someone's face. And I like how sure of himself he is, and how that ties into my takeaway, which is the importance of being believed. He doesn't spend any time questioning if what he sees is real or why it's happening. He doesn't need his comrades to explain it, because what explanation could they give for something so strange? And he can't change what he's experiencing as far as he knows, because how would you? All he needs is for them to believe him. And that's what makes a small gesture later in the episode so powerful. It's a private acknowledgement that he's believed. So I really like this one. It's simple yet effective, carried by understated performances, but I'm iffy on the ending because the reason I don't like it is the same reason I do. Should it have gone down the way it did, and would it have felt out of character if it didn't? Now, apart from Cutie McTootie, the episode stars Dick York, who I know mostly as the husband from Bewitched, which I hate. I'll take I Dream of Jeannie over that show any day, and I dare you to fight me on that. You won't win. I'll just run away. Episode 20, Elegy, is about 3 astronauts who land on an asteroid full of people frozen in place. It was written by Charles Beaumont, and I love this one for the concept alone. It's lovely, yet creepy, and another one where I can't say much without giving away why. There is a line I want to mention though, and it's not really a spoiler because it's said when they're throwing out random theories about what might be happening. One of the astronauts sees something he doesn't recognize, and another explains that it's something from 200 years ago. Yet a few minutes later, they refer to what they see as being more than 200 years ahead of them. I don't know if that was a mistake or if I misinterpreted them, but that's the first time I heard something in one of these episodes that made me say, what? Which is funny because it's the Twilight Zone. The whole thing is what? There's also an exchange at the end of the episode that I think you'll find familiar if you watch horror. But this is absolutely one of my favorite episodes, probably in my top 5 for this season at least, and I have no takeaway for it because the best takeaway is mentioned in the episode itself. Episode 21, Mirror Image, is another favorite of mine, though I don't like it nearly as much as Elegy, and I'll loosely describe it as being about a woman people have seen before. I enjoy the simplicity of it, both the setting and the setup, and the fact that we get to view the woman's behavior from different perspectives. Is she being gaslit, or is she losing her mind? Depends on who you ask. But it's also one of the most infuriating episodes I've ever seen, and I know you won't understand what I mean by this until you've watched it, but pick up your fucking bag and hold it! Also, this part I am going to spoil, because no matter how many times I've seen it, I'm enraged by it. This punchable-faced man no one asked for, okay? Nobody added him to their cart and checked out. Nobody chose free shipping. He takes it upon himself to stay with the woman out of concern instead of taking his ass wherever he needed to go, only to immediately do the thing she said he'd do if she confided in him. What's the takeaway here? If you think someone's crazy, maybe leave them alone. And he runs like an idiot, which is saying something given that everyone ran with T-Rex arms back then. That's why they didn't get anywhere. Nevertheless, I like the episode, though I'm sure I give it extra points for the subject matter, which I find riveting. And it stars Vera Miles, who you may recognize from the original Psycho. Not as the woman who got eep eep in the shower, that was Janet Leigh, but as her sister who came looking for her. Episode 22, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, is about an idyllic suburban neighborhood that turns on itself. This I can go into detail about because it's carried more by the execution than the twist, and there are so many takeaways that couldn't be more timely to revisit given our current climate. The political one, not the global one that's burning us alive. So the episode starts with something passing overhead, an object that's flying but unidentifiable. One might even call it a UFO. Neighbors on the street notice it, and everyone says it was a meteor, which I think the kiddies would call huffing copium, so they move on with their day until all of the power goes out on their street. In fact, nothing works. Not their phones, not their radios, not even their cars. The main townie, Steve, offers to walk to the police station to report the issue and see what he can find out, until a teenager says that whoever was in that thing that flew by doesn't want them to leave. The adults ignore him at first, blaming the media he consumes, and it reminds me of today on a few levels. On one hand, you have the younger generation waving red flags about the state of affairs, yet despite seeing what's happening so clearly, their voices are dismissed by the older generation that accuses them of needing to get off the computer and go outside. But on the other hand, media does influence that generation, along with everyone else, allowing just as much misinformation to spread as information. And that happens here, because while the teenager seems to be right about someone shutting things down on purpose, he also says that whoever did it sent beings who look like humans ahead of them to prepare for their landing. That, of course, is reminiscent of conspiracy theories we see today that often start with reasonable questions and curiosity before devolving into loony fuel. And the danger is that you never know who'll start believing a conspiracy over time, because once an idea is planted, all you have to do is feed it to watch it grow. And grow it does in this episode when a neighbor's car turns on. Not only does he become the target of the town's suspicions, his entire history is placed under a microscope. We see this today too, especially on social media. As soon as any claims are made about you, it doesn't matter how weak the evidence is or how baseless the claims are. People will look for ways to validate them. Someone says you're racist, and suddenly your innocuous tweet about vanilla ice cream being superior to chocolate is a dog whistle. Accused of grooming? Sorry, but the fact that you thumbs up a song by a 17-year-old is now sus. A person's house gets vandalized and everyone knows you don't like them? Well, you'd better explain that picture you took at a restaurant in the same city they live in. Granted, you also live in that city, but don't dodge the question, why were you eating out? All it takes is a man's car to start for the people he's lived with for 5 years to cast doubt on him, and he lays out the takeaway himself. Those people, so eager to turn on their neighbors because they've succumbed to mindless fear, don't know what they're starting, or that that's what they should fear. I don't know what my favorite episode is, but I do think this is in my top 5 because there's just so much to like in it. Small decisions that I won't argue were intentional, they just bolster the narrative. Like the fact that Steve, who arguably opened the door to the shenanigans by letting the teenager speak his mind, is the one trying hardest to rein it in. Because how do we reconcile the need for freedom of speech with the damage that speech can do? And how accountable should we be when the rhetoric we give a platform to leads to the type of attitudes we're against? It really is a fantastic episode, if heavy-handed, and its strength is in not depicting every neighbor as one note. Some are quicker to presume guilt than others, some are quicker to violence than others. Some don't speak up even though they know what's happening is wrong, others condemn it loudly, others praise it just as loud. And that's reality, right? We're not all the same, but we have to live with each other and find ways to make it work, which we're great at! It may be strange to say this. The fact that this episode is one of the most beloved and highly rated in the entire series is bittersweet. It signals that people recognize the significance of the lesson it teaches, but the bitter part is that even when we see the lesson, we don't learn it. Anywho, the episode stars Claude Akins, who I remember from Rawhide and Gunsmoke because I watched a ton of westerns growing up, apparently. And can I just say that when I die, I hope to not leave behind a bio that describes me as beefy. Granted, I'm a lady, but even for a man, I think it's a weird way to describe someone in relation to his profession when said profession isn't being a hamburger. Episode 23, A World of Difference, is about a man who suddenly finds himself on the set of a film. It was written by Richard Matheson, which explains the simple premise, and it also rehashes concepts we've seen. Someone who wishes he could escape a stressful life. Someone everyone thinks is going mad. And I have to say, while other episodes manage to be transformative in how they tackle those conflicts, this one isn't. It feels like the 16mm shrine and a walking distance had a baby. The kind you say looks healthy or happy instead of calling it cute, because it's not. Though, unlike that baby, I hate this episode. It's boring and bland, and I accept Matheson's apology for writing it, because he wrote a lot of things people have enjoyed since, like I Am Legend, which isn't a shout out to his best work by any stretch, just to something people would know. Keeping in mind that he died 10 years ago, the fact that his writing contributes to movies and shows we watch today got me thinking. With social media being the incurable disease that it is, we know a lot more about artists and their personal lives while they're creating their art than we did in the past. And I think it's important to consider how that influences the way we perceive their work, because we're far more likely to read into it based on what we know about them or the things they say and do when it's contemporary. Would we be as quick to assume that a character in a show was a self-insert, for example, if we didn't know the creator when they made it? Imagine shooting a film about an unhappy drunk with a shrill wife. I guarantee that someone who sees your wife roll her eyes at you will try to connect the dots. And if you write a song about an abusive relationship titled Half of Me, try convincing your fans that it's not about the lawsuit you filed against your manager, because didn't you just say in a live stream that he stole half your earnings? Is that level of intimate knowledge better or worse for art? For me, in one specific way, it's worse, and it relates to the reason I don't research anything about a film before I review it. The more I know about the circumstances surrounding its production or the intent of the people involved, the harder it is to see the film for what it is independent of that, and that's the perspective I value most when doing a review. So this episode sucks, and it stars David White, who I remember as Larry Tate from Bewitched, which also sucked, as well as Howard Duff, whose bio is again needlessly macho. Tough, virile, wavy-haired, and ruggedly handsome, had relationships with cinema's most dazzling ladies. Calm down. Though it does make me wonder now how widespread a trend that is. These golden age actors being described like someone psyching themselves up in the mirror after a shower. I also wonder if any of the actresses have fluffy bios too. You know, like buxom, silky-tressed, aggressively hourglassed bombshell Mary Ann Hawthorne. Episode 24, Long Live Walter Jameson, is about a professor, and I'm sure you understand by now that the vaguer I am with my description, the more important the details are to the twist. It was written by Charles Beaumont, and I like it because it confronts our mortality, and there are some memorable lines like, "Whoever loved a stone?" But what I like most is that despite the grand cosmic questions hanging over the characters about life and death, it all boils down to relationships in the end. It also has that straightforward, no-frills writing Beaumont does so well. Any takeaway would give away the plot, so we'll do without one. But it stars Dottie Heath, whose head is shaped like a Roblox character. I remember her from Brigadoon, which I really liked, and is of course the inspiration for the musical comedy Schmigadoon with Keegan-Michael Key. It also stars Kevin McCarthy, who was in the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and too many shows to count. Episode 25, People Are Alike All Over, is about two astronauts this time who crash land on Mars, and we're back to Serling's adaptations. It's based on Brothers Beyond the Void, a short story by Paul Fairman, and I should mention that some of Serling's adaptations weren't as faithful to the source material as others. I think this one is, but the phrase based on may be a little loosey-goosey sometimes. Regardless, this episode is one of my favorites. I might even go so far as to say top 10 in the series, if I could remember enough episodes off the top of my head to make that claim, but I love that it does so much with so little, and that everything about it is summed up by the title alone. No takeaways, it just is one. I will say that the acting in one scene does put me off because it gave the character's intention away to no benefit story-wise, and it ruined the tone and build-up. But it doesn't ruin the ending, so I can forgive it. The episode stars Roddy McDowall, who voiced a lot of animated characters later in life, like the Mad Hatter in Batman the Animated Series. He also played Peter Vincent in Fright Night, and he was Cornelius in the original Planet of the Apes. Later, he played Caesar, obviously not to be confused with our Caesar played by Andy Serkis. Episode 26, Execution, or The Execution, is about a criminal from the Old West who's transported to the future. It's another adaptation based on the short story of the same name by George Johnson, and I won't say I love it, but I do think it's great, and it does inspire a few takeaways for me that go beyond the surface, which really Serling covers in his narration anyway, so if you watch an episode and aren't sure what it was trying to say, he'll give you his take on it. In this case, he basically says that justice doesn't have an expiration date, which is wishful thinking granted in the story. Not an observation I find true to life, so I'll add a few things, like how we're smart enough to give our advice, but too dumb to take it. The scientist here finds that out the hard way. Or that the more things change, the more things stay the same. I could also go even further and say it's an examination of class. The fact that concepts like right and wrong may persist across them, but how easy it is to define and abide by them can be very different for the haves and have-nots. It's also a question of environment. Can you still blame someone's actions on their circumstances if they act the same when those circumstances change? Maybe the entire takeaway is that you can take the man out of the wild, but you can't take the wild out of the man. And maybe that's selling humanity short on its capacity to be better, but sometimes you are what you are, not because of the hand you were dealt, but because of how you choose to play it. So the episode stars Russell Johnson, who I know as the professor from Gilligan's Island, and I'm pretty sure I had a crush on him growing up. Maybe it was his voice, I don't know. Also, looking out of my window, I just saw a car that looks like the same model as Kit from Knight Rider, and this is the first episode we've had with a full-on fight. Maybe I'm in the minority here because I've heard people say many times that fights in the classics looked goofy and fake, but I think they're way more realistic than the fights we see in media today, because people look like regular folks going at it rather than everyone squaring up like professional kickboxers. And when I compare how many times a woman fights a guy tooth and nail in the classics to now, I think the classics win, because the fights between a woman and a man that I typically see now are either that she stands toe-to-toe with him because she's a special agent or a soldier, a superhero, etc., or she's completely useless, just screaming and flailing around like spaghetti while falling all over the place. And that annoys me because there is another option that we do see in real life. A woman fighting back with all of her strength, messy and desperate, no matter the outcome. I can't remember the last time I saw that in something today that wasn't sadly a news clip, but I feel like a ton of classic fights were like that. And there was more suspense than spectacle because fights in general felt more raw. So it wasn't that obvious from choreography or context who was going to win. The exceptions maybe being comedies and westerns. The fight in this episode is the kind I'm used to seeing from back then, and I wanted to mention that because it just struck me that I don't have the same edge of my seat response to fights today. What I like about modern fight choreography centers mostly around how clever and slick it is. Either way, Albert Salmi, who played the criminal here, his performance carries the episode, and a few of his lines stood out. They may not be quotable because they're so specific, but they get the point across without belaboring it, like the fact that it doesn't matter how far off the ground you are when you're dangling at the end of a rope. That's true, literally and figuratively. And I feel like some might be tempted to say that writing was better back then, but I don't think that's the case. There's just a different feel to it, and performances do most of the heavy lifting these days, along with the writing and direction overall, as opposed to the dialogue delivering banger after banger like in the old days. It does seem like bad writing gets rewarded more than it used to, though. That, or it's just more obvious how much bad writing there is, given all the ways we're able to consume media now, and all the avenues someone can take to have their work seen. Not to put anyone down, but sometimes gates are kept for a reason. Episode 27, The Big Tall Wish, is about an over-the-hill boxer heading into a fight that might be his last. And this is an example of a goofy-looking tussle, complete with questionable sound design punctuated by hilarious cutaways to women shielding their eyes and men balling their fists like they want a piece, because gender! Also, someone holding a microphone like it's a dick. And I'm not just saying that, they're really holding it. But it's another story that leans more towards character study. You're seeing the boxer Boley, played by Ivan Dixon, struggle to accept his fading youth, and how much of it was spent at the end of another man's fist. While I don't hate the episode, and Ivan's performance is great, once it gets into the emotional bits with a kid he has a bond with, the sappiness goes up and the acting quality goes down. And I hate to blame a child actor for it, so I'll blame both of them. The scene where they're hugging and saying, "You gotta believe," "Oh no, I can't," "Oh, you got it, you can," "You can," is not good, And from a writing standpoint, the ending doesn't make any sense. And that's saying something in a series where sense was thrown out the window at conception. Because the episode is more or less about how the older we get and the more life beats us down, the more we lose the ability to believe in wishes and dreams coming true, even when they're staring us right in the face. And not believing has massive consequences, yet the person who suffers those consequences doesn't seem fazed by it at all. Which is like, okay, what was the point of that then? Like Bowley, the writing plummeted to the ground, and it's a shame because it's the first episode that features not only a black lead, but 3 of them. So it would have been nice if it wasn't also the first one where Serling seemed to forget how to finish what he started. The first, but not the last. Also, Bowley's trainer looks like a mini Willem Dafoe, so I guess it wasn't a total loss. Incidentally, since I didn't recognize Ivan Dixon from anything, I took a look at his bio, and here we go again. A handsome, mustachioed African-American with a solid frame. Listen, I've only looked at 3 bios so far, so while I admit that these aesthetic descriptions could be a coincidence, it's still hilarious. Episode 28, A Nice Place to Visit, is about a thief who gets a belly full of lead courtesy of the coppers. It was written by Charles Beaumont, so you should be able to guess by now what you're in for, a no-frill story with a neat twist. I like the episode mainly because the plot is so simple that seeing it play out adds life to it, especially since the main character is one of those hyper-energetic villains brimming with obnoxious personality. So obnoxious, in fact, that it's the first time I ever heard a white dude call another white dude a cracker on screen, and not as a joke. I haven't mentioned this yet, but all the episodes are half an hour long, minus commercial breaks, so when the story is this basic, there's not a lot to say about it. It might even work well as a 2-sentence horror story. As for takeaways, one is that getting everything you want can be more of a curse than a blessing, because once you have everything, what's left? Not that I agree with that sentiment personally, as someone who'd continue to find enjoyment and meaning in life if I had everything I want, but it certainly doesn't shock me when people with more wealth and privilege than they know what to do with seek out stranger and stranger activities and engage in weirder and weirder behaviors. When you want for nothing to that degree, you have to start making shit up to keep the boredom at bay. The question is, can you do that for eternity? The episode stars Sebastian Cabot, who you may recognize as Sandy Claus from Miracle on 34th Street, and the voice of Bagheera in the original Jungle Book. He also narrated a lot of things because he's British and that's what they do best. Episode 29, Nightmare as a Child, is about a woman visited by a strange little girl. And while I don't place much stock in ratings, I call hockey pucks on this episode being rated higher on IMDb than The Big Tall Wish. Because while the acting is arguably better, the writing is significantly worse. It's like Serling dropped the ball on The Wish, then didn't bother picking it up for this. And I want to be consistent and not intentionally spoiling these episodes, but I'm so tempted to do it here because of how silly it is. I will, however, stick to my guns and try to explain my gripes without giving it away. If I'm not successful, oops. The first issue I'm the least bothered by, and that's the little girl Marky, not to be confused with Marky Mark. I'm okay with the fact that they kind of telegraph who she is right out of the gate, even though it would have been better if they concealed it, but her demeanor doesn't fit. She isn't creepy like, whoa, who is this mysterious girl? She's creepy like, who is this precocious little shit, and why did her cult let her in here? And even that would have been fine if that personality type was established to be one that she and Helen, the main character, share. But it's not, so it needs to serve the plot in some other way, and it doesn't. The whole point of her character is to help Helen remember things, so why is she being so cryptic and condescending about it? It's like installing an app to remind you if you have milk, and when you get to the store, you open it up, and next to the word milk, it says, I don't know, do you? It would have been so much better if Marky wasn't engaging Helen in that way at all. If she was just a little girl that said and did things that triggered Helen's memory without coaxing it out of her. And I understand that given where Marky came from, there can be any number of reasons why she's like that. But good writing doesn't rely on any number of things. It relies on specific things you can readily tie back to the story. My second issue is with the function that Marky serves, because the way things play out, she doesn't serve it. The idea is that by helping Helen remember things she'd forgotten, Marky is protecting her from danger. But she doesn't protect Helen from danger because nothing Helen remembers prevents it. Imagine that you're trying to work up the courage to jump off a swing when it reaches its highest point, which I've done before, and it feels great when you let go and are flying weightless through the air, but when you hit the ground so hard that you end up with skid marks made of grass etched into your skin like you're a Before shirt in a Tide commercial, you realize that at some point in your life, your brain will be far too developed to ever do that again. But you want to do it, so I offer to help by telling you when to jump off. Only the chain snap and you're violently flung across the playground. You know what my reaction wouldn't be? Thank goodness I was there, because I did nothing. Marky does nothing. You could remove her from the episode and it would play out exactly the same, minus the attitude. Issue 3 is a character named Peter, whose last name may as well be File, because the dude keeps talking about how pretty Helen was when she was a kid and how he had a crush on her when she was 10. Now, my issue with this character, besides him making me very uncomfortable, is that he's like the opposite of Marky. She wants Helen to remember things, yet she tiptoes around telling Helen anything that would quickly accomplish that, while Peter doesn't want her to remember things, yet he keeps telling her things unsolicited, albeit for creeper reasons. His character does way more to help Helen than Marky does, which makes Marky's character even more useless. But the worst issue is number 4. None of the Marky stuff matters because none of Helen's memories come into play. There's a pointless exposition dump, there's a pointless fake out after everything is resolved, then Helen says something stupid to another little girl about never losing her smile as if that was the problem. It was just a mess, and the only takeaway I've got is to take away Serling's pen, which I would do if he weren't dead. The episode stars Janice Rule, who appeared in 2 great shows, Ray Bradbury Theater and Murder, She Wrote, and whose bio doesn't have a weird physical description. Episode 30, A Stop at Willoughby, is about an unhappy man who transports to a peaceful town called Willoughby when he falls asleep. And I'm lukewarm on this one, because how many times are we going to do this I want to escape to a better time shtick? There's a whole world of stories to tell, and Serling keeps pulling them out of the same hat. But I do give it points for resolving that conflict in a way the show hadn't done before, and that I somehow don't remember happening. I had a different ending in my mind entirely, despite having seen this episode at least a dozen times. Now, do I prefer how it ended to how I thought it did? Kind of, and no. What I thought I remembered happening is more subtle, while what actually happened makes me laugh picturing it and is also kind of epic. I don't think I ever looked back on this one fondly. I'd call it middling at best, though lots of people love it. I just know that I used to say, Willoughby, next stop Willoughby, all the time because it tickles me. I also don't think I ever had any takeaways from it, but I have one now. If you get the chance, be who you are and do what makes you happy. Don't waste the precious time you have on this godforsaken ball of wet dirt trying to fit in when you can just be comfortable. Episode 31, The Chaser, is about a stalker trying to win a woman's affection. And the best thing about it, hands down, is Professor Damon, played by John McIntyre. Every single line that leaves that man's mouth is gold. And I'm sorry, but I checked his bio because his face isn't familiar. And there it is. Craggy features and a crusty, steely-eyed countenance. Why are these so descriptive? But Serling was back in form here. The episode unfolds like a short story, less character, more plot, a little humor. And I like it even though there's not much to it. I adore that the foreshadowing when you first meet the professor is somehow overt without giving itself away. I adore that it kind of reminds me of Needful Things, only in the sense that the solution creates the problem. And I adore the ending, because the tone is so light, but the reality of it is bleak. I strongly recommend watching this one for Professor Damon alone. Episode 32, A Passage for Trumpet, is about a washed-up musician at the end of his rope. And I'm again glad that I'm revisiting these because I distinctly recall hating this episode. Yet, watching it again now, holy stromboli! When I say that Jack Klugman knocked his monologue about why he drinks out of the J Park, I mean he hit it so hard they called CPS. It was so good that it felt like the actor in the scene with him was just watching his performance rather than waiting for his turn to act. And I've watched Jack in other things, the most prominent being The Odd Couple with Tony Randall. I love that show, and he always struck me as a good actor, but this episode put into perspective just how good he could be in the right moment, and how affecting a believable performance can be compared to one where the lines are just delivered like pizza, on time. The story itself isn't anything to write home about, but it works, and as a jazz lover, I like the setup. The intimacy of the atmosphere is also a highlight because it feels like actors alone on stage, allowing you to focus on them and their words and nothing else. My only issue with this one is that the resolution comes too easily and quickly. I also don't understand why the guy helping him looks like Abraham Lincoln Speakeasy Edition, but I appreciate the implications of that given who he is. So, like I said, I like it. It's a solid character-driven episode that revels in a particular practical effect at one point. When you watch the scene, you'll know because you can just tell that they were proud of it. And my takeaway is to never give up or sell yourself short because a new day is just around the bend. Taking a water break, I wanted to let you in on something in case you couldn't tell. When you look at the title of my videos, some will say review, while others say essay and review. If the title just says review, it means it's just a review. The length of the video doesn't matter, nor does the movie or show. When it says essay and review, it's still just a review, but it's a review where I'm focusing on a particular theme or idea that I want to cover in my review. And the rest of the title should give you more insight into whatever that thing is. So I just thought I'd throw that out there as I'm having my water break, because I know there will be people who look at the length of the video, then watch the video, then bitch about the fact that this doesn't feel like an essay. It doesn't feel like one because it's not. It's a review. Episode 33, Mr. Beavis, is about a kind man down on his luck. At least, that's how it's framed. It's actually one of those stories where most of what goes wrong in a character's life happens because they're weird. And this is a pet peeve of mine, so humor my rant, won't thee? As a lovable weirdo myself, I confess that I've never been so weird that I couldn't fit in when I needed to. And I admit that I find it dysfunctional, not endearing, when a person keeps doing things that result in the opposite of what they want, while acting like those bad things just happened. Unless you have an underlying condition that makes it impossible to not say and do things that get you in trouble or put other people off, I don't feel bad when things don't go your way because you have a choice. If you're on a blind date, for example, and they don't like that you keep blowing bubbles into your drink on purpose, but you refuse to stop, it's not, "Aw shucks, woe is me, today just ain't my day," when they get up and leave. You did that. So this episode is irritating because it does address that, just in a way I don't agree with on principle, even though it makes sense for a fictional story. Mr. Beavis is having the worst day of his life. He gets evicted, gets fired, his car meets God, and he's drowning his sorrows when he's approached by a guardian angel who offers to turn back the clock. But the angel says that if you want the day to end differently, you need to be different yourself. We've all heard some version of the saying that crazy is doing the same thing while expecting different results. And it's true that many of the undesirable circumstances we find ourselves in are a direct result of our own actions, or a tendency to not step outside of our comfort zone even when the way we are, or the way we live, doesn't work. My problem is with the false dichotomy that the episode presents, because the angel helps Mr. Beavis by giving him a new style and a new car and adjusting his behavior to better suit the things he wants, like getting a raise rather than fired. But the change comes at the cost of what he loves and the simple joys he had before, like playing with the neighborhood kids who now want nothing to do with him. I'm not a fan of binary thinking, least of all in extremes, and one sentiment I've seen forever is that you can't be yourself and be likable or successful. And I've always hated that because it isn't true. Even serial killers have stands. So the idea that you have to choose between being a responsible person who gets to work on time or being a fun-loving person kids like to play with is ridiculous. You can be both. Life isn't so black and white that you either drive a flashy car and win, or drive a piece of crap and lose. That you're either a stuffy rich person with no time for sentimental drivel like Christmas carols, or a sensitive poor person who gives the one gift you had to a stranger because you're just so friggin' generous. But what bothers me more is the unspoken conviction that quirky people are low-key superior to those who better fit in, because the stigma some attach to normalcy and the mainstream artificially inflates the virtue of being counterculture or unique. Mr. Beavis isn't better than the rest of his coworkers because they keep their desks clean like they're supposed to, while he keeps a bunch of nonsense on it that gets him in trouble. He's just different. And there's no shortage of people in this world who are different that are also some of the biggest assholes you'll ever meet. They're not all victims of the status quo. Putting it another way, not all dance to the beat of my own drum types are kind, interesting, and good. Just like not all normies are joyless, conformist zombies made out of stale bread. So the episode weaves in and out of my favor. Can your life improve in some ways if you change yourself? Yes. But is giving up who you are entirely the only way you can have anything you want? No. Life is a balancing act, and that's ultimately where the episode lands, on the more realistic note that while you don't need to go to extremes to change your trajectory, some tweaking probably won't hurt. And kudos to there actually being liquid in Mr. Beavis' cup at the start of the episode. I know that's a random thing to give it points for, but there didn't need to be, yet they went there. Episode 34, The After Hours, is about a woman trapped in a department store. After hours. I love this episode. The first line makes me laugh because the salesperson says to the woman named Marcia, "May I show you something?" And Marcia says, "No, that's not what I'm looking for." What's not? She didn't show you anything. Now, granted, that was kind of the point, that it didn't matter what she had to show because Marcia intuitively knew she wanted something else. It still cracks me up. Now, there isn't much to say about this one. I love the acting, and the atmosphere is genuinely creepy. In fact, the whole setting is an overreacting gamer's wet dream. But the best part isn't just the twist, it's the lore surrounding it. Also, this face. There's no takeaway here, it's just a cool story, and it stars Anne Francis, who was cute as a button and appeared in a ton of shows I'm sure I've seen her in but don't remember her in. It also stars James Milholland, who is a pretty popular character actor with a pinched face and somewhat pop eyes, according to his bio. Episode 35, The Mighty Casey, is a silly one. And I do mean silly, about a sucky baseball team being gifted with a star player who turns out to be a robot. And don't worry, that's not the twist. As part of a film where more happens and they have these wacky adventures as a team, I probably wouldn't mind it, but thinking about sitting there back in the 60s, loving the Twilight Zone, and itching to watch next week's episode, only to have it be this, I don't know. It's not that it's too silly. I guess it just doesn't feel like a Twilight Zone episode, so consider it a palate cleanser if you're watching these back to back. Is there a takeaway? Sure. Humanity means having a heart. Last but not least, we've come to episode 36, the season finale, A World of His Own, written by Richard Matheson, and the season goes out on a high note with this one. It's about a writer whose wife thinks he's cheating on her, and I love it. The premise is solid, the performances are humorous, the twist is great, and the ending is just so clever and fun. I don't know if it's fair to treat it like other episodes given that it's special because of how they handled it as a finale, but it puts a smile on my face and caught me off guard in a way that was thoroughly satisfying. It's absolutely worth a watch. So, that was season 1 of The Twilight Zone, and going back to it after what's probably been a decade of not watching any of it anymore, it still holds up. Even more so now, considering how many things I found a new appreciation for within it. Now I'm actually tempted to do this again for season 2, but if I do it, it won't be anytime soon, or maybe ever if no one bothers watching this. I may just watch all the seasons again on my own and keep my thoughts to myself. But as always, my goal at Stream Come True is to share my passion for storytelling and encourage you to dive into all of the amazing and not so amazing content streaming near you. So if you're interested in watching this season of The Twilight Zone, you can do so for free. I'll link to it in the box. Thank you for watching, subscribe on your way out, and good night, streamers.